Once upon a time, in a quiet mountain town, far from the noise of ambition and applause, there lived a man named Haruto Nishikawa. Haruto was born into an ordinary family that repaired roofs and tended small gardens, and nothing about his childhood suggested greatness. Yet from a young age, Haruto carried an intense inner vision of who he believed he could become. He imagined himself disciplined, respected, and powerful in ways that went beyond physical strength. He spoke often about the future version of himself, the man who would wake before sunrise, train relentlessly, and master difficult skills others avoided. He loved describing this future in detail, as if narrating a story that already existed. Friends admired his clarity. Elders nodded at his confidence. Haruto felt proud of how vividly he could see the life ahead of him. But when the morning arrived, Haruto moved slowly. He told himself he would start tomorrow once he felt sharper, once conditions felt right. He read manuals instead of practicing. He planned routines instead of following them. He convinced himself that thinking deeply was part of the work. Weeks passed, then months. While others quietly trained in the cold mornings, Haruto refined his vision even further. The image of his future self became more detailed, more impressive, and more distant. Over time, something strange happened. The stronger his dream became, the weaker his actions grew. Starting felt heavier. The gap between who he imagined himself to be and who he was became uncomfortable to face. Years later, Haruto stood watching younger men perform skills he once spoke confidently about mastering. They were not more talented than him. They were not more intelligent. They were simply consistent. In that moment, Haruto felt a quiet realization settle in his chest. His dream had never demanded effort from him. It had rewarded him emotionally without requiring action. He had mistaken intention for progress, imagination for discipline. Standing there, he wondered something that unsettled him deeply. Had his vision of greatness been helping him all along, or had it been the very thing keeping him stuck? If you've ever felt that same tension between who you want to become and what you actually do each day, you already understand the trap Haruto fell into. Because the most dangerous obstacle to growth is not laziness in the obvious sense. It is the comforting illusion that thinking about change is the same as changing. The mind is incredibly skilled at rewarding us prematurely. Neuroscience has shown that when we talk about our goals or vividly imagine success, the brain releases small amounts of dopamine, the same chemical associated with achievement. In simple terms, your brain can't always tell the difference between doing the work and fantasizing about the outcome. That means every time you announce your plans without backing them with action, you may be stealing motivation from your future self. This is why ambition alone so often fails. We are taught that wanting something badly enough is the key, that strong desire naturally turns into effort. But in reality, desire without structure often creates paralysis. The bigger the dream, the heavier the starting point feels. The mind focuses on the distance instead of the next step. You tell yourself you need more preparation, more clarity, more energy. And without realizing it, you turn waiting into a habit. Psychologists call this intention-action gap, the space between deciding to do something and actually doing it. Most people live inside this gap far longer than they realize. What makes this gap so dangerous is how reasonable it feels. Planning feels productive. Learning feels productive. Talking feels productive. But none of them place stress on the identity you are trying to build. Action does. Action forces you to confront weakness, inconsistency, and discomfort. That's why the mind resists it. Not because you are incapable, but because action threatens the fantasy version of yourself. As long as you haven't started, you can still believe you would be great if you did. The moment you act, that illusion is tested. There is a reason ancient warriors and craftsmen did not rely on motivation. They understood something modern culture often forgets. Motivation is unstable. It rises and falls with sleep, mood, weather, and confidence. If action depends on motivation, progress becomes accidental. The people who quietly outperform everyone else are not the most inspired. They are the most structured. They remove decision-making from the process. They act first and let emotion catch up later. Modern behavioral studies support this ancient wisdom. Research from Stanford University has shown that behavior change is far more likely when actions are made small and repeatable, rather than tied to emotional intensity. When you lower the threshold for action, you bypass resistance. The brain stops arguing because the task no longer feels threatening. This is why people who commit to 5 minutes a day often outperform those who wait for the perfect hour-long session. Momentum is born from movement, not intention. Halfway through this video, if this is already challenging the way you think about motivation and discipline, take a second to like the video. Not as a favor to me, but as a small act of alignment with the part of you that wants to stop waiting and start moving. Sometimes even that click is a reminder that action, however minor, is how momentum begins. The illusion we fall into is believing that discipline is a personality trait, that some people are born with it and others are not. But discipline is not an identity. It is a system. It is something built through repetition, not discovered through inspiration. Ancient warrior traditions understood this deeply. They didn't ask, "Do I feel like training today?" Training was not something they negotiated with their emotions, it was something they did because that was who they were becoming. There is an important distinction here. Acting without motivation does not mean forcing yourself through pain endlessly. It means removing emotion from the decision to begin. You don't wait to feel confident before taking a step. Confidence is the result of stepping. You don't wait to feel ready before practicing. Readiness is the byproduct of repetition. The order matters more than we think. Action first, emotion second. This principle shows up everywhere when you look closely. Writers who wait for inspiration rarely finish books. Writers who write at the same time each day eventually find inspiration waiting for them on the page. Athletes who train only when energized plateau. Athletes who train consistently build energy through movement. Even relationships follow this pattern. People who wait to feel connected before showing effort drift apart. Those who show up consistently often rebuild connection through action itself. What keeps most people trapped is not lack of knowledge, it is lack of identity alignment. If you see yourself as someone who wants to change, you are still emotionally attached to your current self. If you see yourself as someone who acts regardless of mood, behavior becomes simpler. The ancient mindset was not about heroics, it was about inevitability. The work was not dramatic, it was quiet, repetitive, sometimes boring, and that was the point. The mind loves drama. It loves big turning points and sudden transformations. But real growth is unremarkable in the moment. It doesn't announce itself, it accumulates. This is why small daily actions feel insignificant until they suddenly aren't. You don't notice progress linearly. You notice it in contrast. One day you realize something that once felt hard now feels automatic. That is not motivation, that is conditioning. There is also a subtle danger in consuming too much inspirational content without acting. It creates emotional movement without physical movement. You feel stirred, reflective, awakened, but nothing changes. Over time, the mind associates reflection with completion. This is why some people watch endless self-improvement videos while their lives remain unchanged. They are not lazy. They are overstimulated by insight and undercommitted to execution. The solution is not more intensity. It is more friction removal. You don't need to become a new person overnight. You need to become someone who starts even when starting feels unimpressive. Ancient training philosophies emphasize consistency over intensity because intensity burns out. Consistency compounds. Even 5 minutes a day, when done without negotiation, becomes an identity anchor. You stop asking who you want to be and start acting like who you are becoming. Fear often hides beneath the need for motivation. Fear of failing, fear of looking foolish, fear of discovering limits. Waiting feels safer than starting because starting exposes truth. But truth is not your enemy. Stagnation is. The longer you delay, the heavier the starting point becomes, not because the task changed, but because your self-trust eroded. Every promise you break to yourself weakens the voice that says, "I do what I say I'll do." Rebuilding that voice does not require grand gestures, it requires small, kept promises. This is how discipline is restored, not by proving strength, but by proving reliability. When you act despite resistance, you send a signal to yourself that your word matters. That signal compounds faster than any motivational speech ever could. Haruto eventually understood this, but not through a sudden revelation. It came quietly. He began with actions so small they felt almost embarrassing. A few minutes of practice, one uncomfortable repetition, no announcement, no grand plan, just movement. At first nothing changed, but he kept going, and something subtle happened. The voice in his head that once negotiated began to quiet. Not because it disappeared, but because it was no longer in control. The real shift is not becoming more motivated, it is becoming less dependent on motivation. When action becomes automatic, emotion follows. When commitment replaces mood, progress becomes predictable. This is the difference between people who admire discipline and people who live it. One group waits, the other moves. If there is one truth worth carrying forward, it is this: your future is not shaped by what you want most. It is shaped by what you do repeatedly, especially on the days you don't feel like it. Dreams are not dangerous because they are unrealistic. They are dangerous because they can feel complete without effort. Action is uncomfortable because it is honest. So the question is no longer whether you feel ready, inspired, or motivated. The real question is much simpler and much harder to avoid. What is the smallest action you can take today that proves you are done waiting? And what happens to your life if you take it every day from here on out?